Welcome back to the channel, where we uncover the shadows that history tried to hide. Today's story isn't just about a king. It's about a choice so twisted, so unnatural, that it echoed across generations, a choice that turned royal blood into poison. Imagine a man born to rule, born into unimaginable privilege, who looked at his own sister not as family, but as a bride. What began as an act of power and defiance would soon unravel into a legacy of madness, betrayal, and death. Sit back, maybe light a candle if you're alone. This is the kind of story that creeps in slowly, soft as silk, but leaves its mark like a blade. This is the true, cursed tale of the king who married his own sister and doomed his bloodline forever. Our story begins not in Europe, as many might expect, but deep in the golden deserts of ancient Egypt, where royalty didn't just rule, they were worshipped. In a world where kings were gods and blood was the holiest thing of all, the ancient pharaohs lived by a terrifying code. The blood of the gods must remain pure. That meant one thing: incest was not just allowed, it was sacred. Brothers married sisters, fathers married daughters, and the palace became a place where family ties were tangled far beyond what the outside world could accept. But even in a place like this, one union stood out. One that would break more than just taboos. One that would ignite a curse. Pharaoh Akhenaten was no ordinary king. From the moment he took the throne, he was different. He spoke of a single god, the sun Discotten, and tried to erase the mighty old gods of Egypt, the ones worshipped for thousands of years. He moved the capital to a new city, cast down the priests, and demanded that all worship pass through him. He wasn't just a king, he wanted to be the only bridge between the heavens and the earth. And to complete his divine vision, he needed a queen, not just any queen, but someone who was also seen as divine. That's when his eyes turned toward his own blood. Scholars believe that Akhenaten married at least one of his own daughters. And yet before that, there was another woman at his side, a sister, possibly full-blooded, whose name has been nearly erased from history. Some fragments refer to her as Saitamen. Others believe her name was Beketaten. The records are scarce, suspiciously edited, but the signs are all there. The paintings, the inscriptions, the eerie placement of their tombs, all of it points to one of the darkest royal unions the ancient world has ever known. And from that moment, everything began to change. Soon after the marriage, the royal court became a place of whispers. Crops began to fail, plagues swept through the Nile Valley. Children born to the union, if they survived at all, came into the world deformed, fragile, or struck down by illness before they reached adulthood. Akhenaten's son, Tutankhamun, the boy king later made famous by his golden tomb, was born with a twisted foot and a cleft palate. Recent DNA analysis suggests that his parents were brother and sister. The curse wasn't just symbolic, it was literal, buried deep in the genetic code of a family that dared to play God. Inside the palace, there were signs of something worse than just disease. Murals that once showed strength now hinted at suffering. A royal daughter is depicted with an elongated skull, her limbs limp, held up by servants because she cannot stand. One child after another disappeared from records, their tombs empty or hastily sealed. There are even theories, quiet ones, the kind of Egyptologists share in hushed tones, that some of the children were offered as sacrifices to appease the angry gods Akhenaten tried to suppress. No one knows for sure, but what's clear is that the once great dynasty was crumbling from the inside. Outside the palace, the people grew restless. The sun god Aten brought no rain. Temples to old gods stood abandoned, their priests seething in the shadows. Rumors spread that the royal family was cursed, not by enemies, but by their own actions. The incestuous marriage, the rejection of the gods, the deaths of innocent children, all of it fed a growing belief that something unnatural had taken root in the heart of Egypt. As Akhenaten's health declined, so did his grip on reality. He spoke to the sun as if it were his father, his lover, his only friend. He stopped appearing in public. When he did, he looked thin, sunken, a shadow of the man who once claimed the heavens. Some say he went mad, others say he finally saw what he had done. His wife, his sister, vanishes from the records entirely. No grave, no cause of death, just silence, as if she had never existed at all. After Akhenaten died, Egypt tried desperately to erase his memory. His city was abandoned, his monuments defaced. Even his name was left off king lists, but the curse lingered. His son, Tutankhamun, took the throne, a sickly boy barely able to walk, ruled from behind the scenes by powerful advisors. He died before the age of 20, leaving no heir, and with him, Akhenaten's bloodline ended. The throne passed to outsiders, military men, and ambitious priests. The divine family was gone, wiped out not by war, but by its own sins, and yet, the pattern didn't stop there. Centuries later, in faraway Europe, another royal house began to imitate the old ways. Not for godhood, but for power, the Habsburgs of Austria and Spain, obsessed with keeping royal blood pure, began marrying cousins, nieces, even uncles and nieces. Over generations, their family tree folded in on itself like a crushed scroll. Children were born with jaws so large they couldn't chew, minds so feeble they couldn't rule, and bodies so frail they barely lived long enough to wear the crown. And at the root of it all was the same idea, that power must be kept in the family, no matter the cost. The story of Akhenaten is more than a bizarre historical footnote. It's a warning that when power turns inward, when kings see themselves as gods and sisters as wives, something ancient and cruel stirs awake. The kind of curse that doesn't vanish when a dynasty dies but waits patiently, hidden in the blood. But this is only the beginning, because long after Egypt fell silent, after its palaces crumbled into sand, the curse traveled. It took new forms, found new thrones, and touched new crowns in ways no one could have imagined. As the sands of Egypt swallowed Akhenaten's city and silence fell over his erased dynasty, the world above moved on, oblivious to the shadow that lingered. But curses, if they are real at all, rarely stay buried. They seep through time, slipping into bloodlines that repeat the same fatal mistake, believing that power is more important than nature, that the throne is worth more than morality. In a different land, under a different sky, another royal house rose to unimaginable heights, only to be slowly, brutally dragged down by its own obsession with blood. Centuries later and thousands of miles away, Europe had entered the age of empires. Thrones multiplied, kings fought for territory, alliances were forged with ink and rings instead of swords. But underneath the ceremony and splendor, one belief remained unchanged, that royal blood must remain pure. And nowhere was this belief more grotesquely followed than in the House of Habsburg, a dynasty so massive and interconnected it ruled over half of Europe at its peak. Austria, Spain, Hungary, Bohemia, parts of Italy, and the Netherlands, all under the command of a single bloodline that refused to let outsiders in. The Habsburgs did not invent incestuous marriage in Europe, but they perfected it. While most royal families married cousins as political strategy, the Habsburgs took it further, uncle to niece, first cousin to first cousin, over and over, generation after generation. It wasn't hidden, it was openly practiced, recorded in marriage contracts, even celebrated in paintings. And slowly, over centuries, the results began to show, not just in deformities, but in something deeper, something darker. Something that whispered of a curse older than their empire. Let's talk about Charles II of Spain, perhaps the most infamous product of Habsburg inbreeding. When he was born in 1661, it was immediately clear something was wrong. He was sickly, frail, and unusually quiet. As he grew, the problems became impossible to ignore. He couldn't speak properly until he was 4. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His tongue was so large that he drooled constantly and could barely eat. His Habsburg jaw, a genetic deformity passed down through generations, was so pronounced that his upper and lower teeth couldn't meet, making chewing nearly impossible. But these were just the visible signs. Mentally, Charles never developed beyond the mind of a child. He was considered simple, but polite, lonely, but good-hearted. He was often treated more like a relic than a king, preserved, displayed, and used to maintain the illusion of royal continuity. Behind the palace walls, his caretakers believed he was cursed. Priests performed exorcisms. Nobles whispered that dark magic had twisted his soul. But the truth, far more tragic, was written in his family tree, a web of repeated unions that collapsed in on itself. Charles's parents were uncle and niece. His grandparents were also closely related. His great-grandparents shared more than blood. They shared ancestors going back several generations. By the time Charles was born, he had more genetic similarity to a child born of siblings than to one from unrelated parents. The royal obsession with purity had become a slow-motion suicide, and Charles was its final, gasping breath. He reigned over Spain for 35 years, but it was a reign in name only. He could not produce an heir. He could barely command his court, let alone a country. Under his rule, Spain collapsed into economic despair, famine, and war. When he died childless in 1700, the Habsburg line in Spain ended. His will, manipulated by foreign powers, triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, a conflict that dragged Europe into chaos for more than a decade. The death of one broken king unleashed a storm, and behind it loomed the weight of centuries of incest, arrogance, and denial. But here's where it gets stranger. Charles, despite his condition, reportedly believed in the supernatural. Toward the end of his life, he demanded the exhumation of his royal ancestors. One by one, their tombs were opened, their bodies examined. Charles wanted answers. He wanted to know if the dead could explain his misery. When he saw the decayed remains of his relatives, kings and queens, princes and princesses, he reportedly turned pale and whispered, "All of them are rotting, and so am I." The court never spoke of it again. But some say it was that moment, seeing his family return to dust, that broke him completely. In another timeline, the story might have ended there. But this curse, or pattern, if you prefer, found its way across continents, across cultures, resurfacing in the unlikeliest of places. In ancient Hawaii, royal incest was considered divine. High-ranking siblings married to preserve mana. Spiritual power. In the Incan Empire, rulers were expected to marry their sisters. Even in medieval Japan, cousin marriage among the nobility was common, a sign of elite purity, not perversion. These weren't isolated practices, they were global echoes of the same belief, that the blood of rulers must not be diluted. But the longer these unions continued, the more fragile the families became. Children born with illnesses, rulers dying young, empires slowly slipping through fingers that could no longer hold the sword or the pen. The great royal houses of history, the Ptolemies of Egypt, the Habsburgs of Europe, the royal line of Hawaii, all followed the same arc: rise, purify, marry inward, decline, collapse. And through it all, people spoke of curses. They gave names to the suffering. They said the gods were angry. They said spirits demanded retribution. But the real horror, perhaps, was not in the supernatural at all. It was in what happens when power corrupts not just minds, but DNA. The modern world would like to think it has moved on, that the age of kings and arranged marriages is over, but the echoes remain. Genetic diseases still haunt certain royal lines. Rumors still swirl about secrets hidden in palaces. And even today, the pressure to keep power close, to marry within circles, to control bloodlines, hasn't entirely vanished. It just wears a different crown. What began with Akhenaten, a king who saw himself as a god and chose his sister as a queen, did not end with his son's tomb. It lived on in painted halls and dusty scrolls, in broken family trees that loop in on themselves like a snake eating its tail. And if you look closely enough at history, you'll see the same pattern forming again and again, like a whisper in the blood, like a curse no one can quite shake. But there's one final chapter still waiting in the shadows, the story of a royal house that tried to outrun the curse, only to find it already blooming within. Because even the most beautiful, Palaces have walls that remember, and sometimes those walls bleed. The curse, if it was one, didn't care for borders or languages. It didn't care whether a king wore a white linen crown beneath the desert sun or a golden one beneath the chandeliers of Versailles. It moved where power moved, whispering through dynasties, watching as one royal house after another stumbled into the same trap. And so it was that centuries after Akhenaten took his sister to bed and the Habsburgs bred their own blood into ruin, a new royal family would unknowingly open the same door. This time, in the grand and glittering palaces of France, the French Bourbons had always been admired for their taste, their wealth, their elegance. They were the kings who built Versailles, who brought art and fashion to the center of Europe. But beneath the perfume and powdered wigs was a dark thread. The Bourbons, too, married their cousins, not always, not as obsessively as the Habsburgs, but enough to invite something old back into their veins. And though they didn't marry their sisters, the warning signs still came. Louis XIV, the Sun King, ruled longer than any monarch in European history. His reign was magnificent: fountains, operas, expansion, glory. But behind his towering image, his family tree was beginning to rot. His descendants married cousins from within the Bourbon branch, often from Spain, where the curse had already done its damage. Generation after generation, the genetic flaws began to compound: brittle health, weak immune systems, mental instability. Still, they ignored it. They celebrated royal unions as divine fate. And then came Louis XVI. When Louis XVI took the throne in 1774, he was just 20 years old. By then, the inbreeding had quieted into the background, a family habit, not a headline. He married Marie Antoinette, herself a product of the Habsburg dynasty. Though they were technically second cousins once removed, their bloodlines were intertwined through generations of repeated unions. Neither of them was prepared to rule. Both of them were doomed from the start. Louis was shy, socially awkward, and reportedly suffered from a condition called phimosis, which made intercourse painful and difficult. For the first 7 years of their marriage, it remained unconsummated. A national embarrassment in a country obsessed with royal fertility. Rumors swirled. Was he impotent? Was she unfaithful? Was their union cursed? The French people laughed, whispered, mocked. But in the background, something darker loomed. Their children were born frail. Of the four, only one survived to adulthood, and even then, just barely. Their son, Louis Charles, the Dauphin, was a sickly boy with frequent fevers and chronic weakness. After the revolution erupted and his parents were executed, he was locked in a dark prison cell at just 8 years old. For 2 years, he was held in solitary confinement, deprived of sunlight, food, and care. When he died, aged 10, his body was found riddled with signs of abuse, starvation, and illness. Some say he went mad. Others believe he was never truly sane, the curse of blood showing itself in the cruelest way. The fall of the French monarchy was not just political, it was personal. The royal line had grown fragile, aloof, and unnatural. The people, starving and angry, saw their rulers not as divine beings, but as something grotesque. The guillotine didn't just cut off heads. It severed the last thread of a bloodline already unraveling. But perhaps the most chilling echo of the curse came not from the kings and queens themselves, but from those who sought to revive them. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, royalists across Europe attempted to restore fallen monarchies, often by resurrecting the same tainted bloodlines. Pretenders and claimants popped up in every corner: princes whose ancestors had married cousins for generations, whose minds were delicate, whose bodies were fragile, whose eyes seemed to carry some ancient sadness. In one case, a young nobleman from Eastern Europe, a direct descendant of several intertwined royal families, was placed in an asylum after claiming he could hear voices from his ancestors. He painted strange images of palaces in flames, children with twisted limbs, a sun that bled across the sky. Doctors called it schizophrenia. But those who traced his genealogy found something haunting. He was a descendant of both the Spanish Habsburgs and the Bourbon kings of France. Two cursed lines colliding in one man, a man who couldn't carry the weight of what had been passed down. It wasn't an isolated case. Across royal Europe, madness seemed to rise in the blood like a tide. King George III of England, often mocked for losing America, suffered from repeated mental breakdowns later in life. He spoke nonsense, foamed at the mouth, screamed at invisible enemies. Today, some believe he had a genetic disorder, possibly porphyria, that had run quietly through the royal veins. And how did it get there? Through cousin marriage. Through centuries of tightening the noose around their own genetics. Even in the Russian Romanov family, the same story unfolded. Tsarina Alexandra, wife of Nicholas II, was a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and carried the gene for hemophilia, a deadly bleeding disorder passed down to their son, Alexei, a crown prince who could not be injured without risk of death. A boy so fragile that even a bruise could kill him. And what was the origin of this genetic flaw? A single mutation in a royal ancestor, magnified by intermarriage and spread like a shadow across the European courts. By the early 20th century, the royal world began to collapse, not with a scream, but with a sickly whisper. Monarchies fell one by one. The Russian royal family was executed in a basement. German, Austrian, and Ottoman emperors were forced into exile. The world changed, democracy rose. And yet the bloodlines remained, drifting into obscurity, weaker, quieter, but still carrying the marks of what had come before. Today, most of the remaining royal families in England, in Scandinavia, and tiny principalities across Europe have taken steps away from those old practices. Marrying commoners, opening the family, mixing the blood. But even now, whispers remain, hidden disorders, fragile heirs. Mental illnesses kept under wraps, the public smiles, the photographs shine, but behind the curtains, the past lingers like a ghost. What began with one man, a pharaoh in ancient Egypt who believed he could defy nature and take his sister as queen, did not die with his dynasty. It spread like a stain, subtle and silent, carried not by swords or armies, but by the most intimate betrayal of all, the belief that blood is sacred only when it's kept to itself, that purity is worth suffering for, that power should never be shared, and perhaps the most terrifying thought of all is this: maybe it never really ended. Maybe there are still palaces, silent, forgotten, waiting, where portraits of twisted ancestors hang above cribs, where family trees still curl inwards like dying vines. Where a child is born and everyone holds their breath, praying the curse didn't choose this one too. The weight of a crown is not measured only in gold and jewels. Sometimes it is carried in the blood, in the brittle bones of a sickly heir, in the hollow stare of a monarch born to rule but unable to understand why the walls are closing in. Sometimes it moves quietly through generations, invisible to the outside world, but loud within the private corridors of palaces. It whispers in family portraits, in carefully controlled marriages, in the decision to keep the bloodline clean. And what began as a royal obsession with divine purity eventually took the form of a curse that would follow some of the most powerful families in history until they fell, one by one, under the weight of their own lineage. But even as thrones fell and empires faded, the bloodlines continued. Hidden now, folded into modernity, take the Windsors, the British royal family. Though far more open in recent generations, marrying outside nobility, allowing modern love stories to shape the line of succession, they too come from the same tangled roots. Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip were third cousins through Queen Victoria and second cousins once removed through King Christian IX of Denmark. Their children carry within them the genetic legacy of dozens of interlinked royal houses. The very idea of royal blood is built on the idea of exclusivity, of repetition, of keeping power in the family, and that idea, though softer now, still shapes the world. But perhaps the most unsettling part of this story is not just the history of what happened, but what might still be happening. Because even now, among the world's remaining royal families, there are secrets, there are illnesses, quietly managed behind closed doors. There are marriages that raise eyebrows in genealogical circles. There are heirs who have vanished from public view, whose conditions are spoken of only in hushed tones. In Thailand, in Saudi Arabia, in smaller European monarchies, there are stories, unconfirmed, unverified, whispered, of children born with abnormalities, of cousins joined in quiet ceremonies, of generations growing weaker even as the titles remain. The modern world has no appetite for these stories. We like our royalty polished and smiling, walking red carpets, waving from balconies. We celebrate the wedding of a prince to a Hollywood actress, a princess to a bodyguard, a royal baby born to a commoner, because it feels like progress. And maybe it is, but behind the scenes, in rooms we will never enter, history may still be repeating itself in soft, silken whispers. Not because anyone wants it to, but because the past has a way of clinging to power, long after the crowns have. And then there's the question no one wants to ask. What if the curse was never supernatural? What if it was simply the result of human arrogance? What if every twisted jaw, every empty cradle, every heir who screamed in their sleep wasn't the wrath of gods, but the cost of ignoring nature? What if the greatest horror in royal history is that it could have been prevented and wasn't? Because Akhenaten didn't marry his sister out of love. He did it to prove a point, to assert divinity, to claim his blood was above the laws that govern the rest of us. The Habsburgs didn't marry cousins because they couldn't find love elsewhere. They did it because they believed no one else was worthy of joining them. These were not accidents, these were choices, deliberate, repeated, and ruinous. The tragedy was not in what they suffered, it was in the fact that they saw it coming and chose it anyway, and so the curse endured, not just as a myth, but as a pattern. A warning etched into marble tombs and sun-faded paintings, whispered in the crumbling halls of once mighty palaces. It is the curse of closed blood, of blind tradition, of the belief that greatness must be preserved, no matter the cost. There is something uniquely haunting about how many of these stories end the same way: a powerful ruler, surrounded by wealth, worshipped as a god or respected as a sovereign, dies alone, childless, broken, the last of their line. Their dynasty falls not in battle, but in silence. Not at the hands of invaders, but through a slow collapse from within. It is the kind of death no empire prepares for, not dramatic, but inevitable. Today. We read about them in history books. We stare at their portraits in museums, marvel at their palaces, and wonder how such powerful people could have made such terrible decisions. But perhaps the answer is simpler than we think. They believed they were different, untouchable, chosen, and that belief, that their blood made them special, was the very thing that undid them. And still, deep in the archives of Europe, in dusty royal tombs and sealed-off corridors, the evidence remains. DNA tests conducted in recent years on royal remains have confirmed the extent of inbreeding in some dynasties. Tutankhamun's genetic profile shows the clear markers of incest. Charles II of Spain, when studied retrospectively, revealed a level of genetic collapse rarely seen outside laboratory breeding experiments. These weren't just stories, these were real people, twisted not by fate, but by decisions made generations before they were even born. So where does it end? Does it end at all? Perhaps the final echo of the curse lies not in any one palace or bloodline, but in the human obsession with legacy. The need to preserve a name, to protect the throne, to outlive mortality by passing power through blood. It is an old instinct, as old as civilization itself. But when unchecked, when divorced from reason and nature, it becomes something monstrous. Something that wears a crown, but has no kingdom left to rule. The king who married his own sister didn't just break a taboo, he lit a match. And that fire, fanned by pride and tradition, burned through centuries of history, consuming dynasties, devouring heirs, turning blood into poison. It was a curse of their own making, and in the end, it was the only enemy they could never defeat. Now, the world watches the last few royal families like actors on a stage, admired, envied, photographed. But behind the cameras, behind the grand weddings and national celebrations, the questions still linger. What stories have we not been told what choices are still being made, and what price, if any, is still being paid because the curse was never just a tale. It was a truth inconvenient, ignored, but very real. A truth that began when one man looked at his sister and saw not family, but a throne. A truth that echoed in the cradle of every doomed heir, in the silence of every empty nursery, in the madness of every king who no longer remembered his own name, and perhaps, somewhere, it still echoes, quiet, waiting, watching.